All right. Hello and welcome back to the Futurism at JHU podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas, joined with co-host Ricardo.
What's up, guys?
And today we have a special guest speaker, Joe Varriale. So Joe is a postdoctoral researcher in the lab of doctors Robert and Janet Siciano at the Department of Infectious Disease at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His research focuses on elucidating strategies for the study of the latent reservoir of HIV to achieve a durable cure for HIV. He received his MS in biotechnology and PhD in pharmacology from Johns Hopkins University. Prior to graduate school, he worked as a downstream process engineer at Novavax and the NIH, specializing in techniques such as purification, chromatography, and protein conjugation. He was a Commercialization Academy Fellow at Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures and is currently co-director and host of the Hopkins Biotech Podcast. Following his postdoctoral research, he will be working as a consultant at Boston Consulting Group. So, Joe, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. Just to start off, Ricardo and I would love to learn more about your experiences, particularly, what are the pros and cons of working in biotech as a Novavax versus government like NIH versus academia, so postdoctoral research, and also how did you decide that consulting, at the Boston Consulting Group was the next step?
Yeah, Nicholas and Ricardo, thanks so much for having me on. It's interesting being on the other side of the table. I don't get to give interviews that often. I'm mostly interviewing other people. So as you mentioned in the intro, I actually just finished my postdoc at Hopkins and I'm starting a new job soon. But going backwards into my career progression, in undergrad, I was at the University of Maryland in College Park. I was a biology major and I was always interested in science from a young age, but I don't think I did a whole lot of career exploration in undergrad. I wasn't super familiar with what careers were available to me. And I think like many other biology and chemistry majors, I started out pre-med. I realized pretty early on that medicine was not my desired career path. So I actually ended up getting an internship at Novavax, a small biotech company based in Rockville, Maryland. And that internship turned into a full-time job after I graduated. And this was really my first experience in biotech and exposure to biotech. And I had been familiar with biotech previously, just from being interested in public markets and investing. And so I knew what biotech was, but I didn't really understand how biotechs operated and how drug development was done. Novavax, when I joined in 2015, was a small company, maybe 200 people. And by the time I left, we were about 500 people. So it was really an experience in seeing a biotech company mature. Unfortunately, about 2 years after I joined, we failed a pivotal phase 3 trial for one of our lead drug candidates. And as happens in biotech, I was laid off. And I think something for your listeners who are interested in a career in biotech, layoffs and rifts are pretty inevitable, especially in small biotech. Things happen, companies restructure. But I really used it as a kind of force for change in my career. After I was laid off, I joined the NIH in a process development group doing protein purification, much of the same work that I was doing in biotech, but in government, it was a little bit different. In biotech, often you're working with drug candidates going through clinical development. And in the government, often you're working on drug candidates that are maybe still in the preclinical animal testing phases or early phase 1 development. And then I started my PhD after about 2 years at the NIH. And working in government, I think allowed me to have a better understanding of what academic research was like. And I started my PhD both out of pure intellectual curiosity. I think anyone who does a PhD really needs to be in love with the science and be in love with bench research. But also, I saw a lot of PhDs in my experience in biotech and government. And I saw that a PhD really opens up a lot of career avenues for you. So to sort of go back and summarize those experiences pre-PhD and how it led to my career exploration once I started my PhD, I think the major differences between biotech, government research, and academia is sort of the way that decisions are made. So in biotech, for-profit businesses obviously have a profit motive. So a lot of the decisions are made based on, well, what is going to allow us to get to that revenue stage as quickly as possible, right? You want an approved drug that you can sell and recoup the expenses that you spent on research and development. In government, the decisions are primarily made, at least in the drug development side of the NIH and other government industries, is what's the promising next generation of drugs that should come out of government research. And in government, they do drug development. They also do a lot of basic research, as many of your listeners may be familiar with. But in the drug development setting, the government is good at developing preclinical and maybe phase 1 assets. And after that, for phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, you really need to conduct these, large, often multinational clinical trials to assess whether your drug is effective. And the government is not very well equipped to do that, but biotech and pharma are. So often after an asset makes it through phase 1 clinical trial, it's licensed out to a biotech company or a pharma company, and they're able to take it through to commercialization. Now, in academia, it's very different because the decisions are made based on, how am I able to get funding? And intellectually, what am I interested in? And in academia, there is some aspect of drug development, not that I did in my time, but it's mostly basic research. And so you're understanding, disease pathologies, and you're understanding, how, maybe proteins interact in a cell and how those interactions can be drugged. So a lot of the sort of drug development work in academia and how decisions are made are based on, well, how am I going to get grant funding to move this forward? And eventually, if the idea is interesting, it could be commercialized, but it's often done outside of the principal investigator that made the initial discovery. And I think the paradigm is shifting a little bit now, where PIs and academic labs are spinning out companies, and it's more common. But often these decision-making processes and getting exposure to all three of them was really crucial for my career. So getting to the last part of your question, so how did I decide on consulting as my future career? I did a lot of career exploration. And as I mentioned previously, I was very interested in markets, and the biotech market in particular, and specifically how drugs are developed. And there's the research component, but there's also the business component. And in grad school, we have this sort of term that is the business side of biotech. And it's a broad term that encompasses a lot of different industries, conventional finance. So how are early stage companies funded through mostly venture capital or grants? Then there's the business development aspect. So once a biotech company is funded, how does that company get to commercialization? And what I learned, and I sort of distilled it down to 4 key features, is that the biotech market is very unique. So I just want to take a tangent here to describe in my own opinion, the 4 features that make the biotech market incredibly unique compared to other public markets. So the 4 features are that biotech and drug development is very capital intensive. It costs a lot of money. There is significant risk, and innovation in biotech is really driven by business development. And in biotech, it's really, in my opinion, a need-based market rather than something you want. So to touch on each of those features, capital intensive. Drug development costs a lot of money. People used to say it costs $1 billion and it takes 10 years. Now it's more like 12 to 15 years, and it might cost up to $2.5 billion to get a drug from preclinical discovery, you discover that molecule to approval. So it's very expensive, and that means that there's significant risk in that capital. A lot of early stage drug funding, as I mentioned, is done by venture capitalists. But these companies, in order to run these clinical trials, really need to come up with creative strategies to fund that drug development. So on the second point, there's significant risk. Most drugs fail in clinical trials. And before you even get to a clinical trial, you might have 10,000 compounds for a specific drug target that you're screening in order to get to one compound that you take into a clinical trial. So there's this funnel whereby you discover a target, right? Something you want to drug that's involved in some disease pathology. You find a bunch of molecules that might bind to that target, but you pick a specific one that you think will have, a chance to have efficacy and be safe in humans in a clinical trial. So the risk is immense, and I think this, really requires a lot of smart people analyzing these drug targets. And we could talk about future trends later, but potentially computing power and artificial intelligence to try to tease out specific aspects of drug molecules that might make them good clinical candidates. The third point I think is really important, and this lends itself to why I decided to go into the business side of science, is that innovation in biotech is driven by business development. So business development is the part of biotech that deals in acquisition and licensing of assets, and drug molecules, early stage drug molecules especially, may be promising in clinical trials. It takes a lot of money. So how do you get the money to fund those clinical trials if you're a small company? Well, you might partner with a big pharma company. That big pharma company might take on some of the costs to develop that drug. And in return, they get some share of that drug's profits if it's approved. So for this reason, biotech companies, this is the natural progression, reach a certain maturity, and the natural course of a biotech company is that they get acquired. Small companies have a promising drug candidate. Maybe it gets approved. Maybe it gets through a pivotal trial that shows that this drug works in humans, and that company or that asset might get acquired. So I think this is why in biotech, which is particularly unique, we see many companies in the sort of market cap range of hundreds of millions of dollars to maybe the $10 billion range. And then we have our big pharma companies that are greater than 80 to 100 billion. But you don't see many companies in between, because companies get acquired if they have successful drugs. And this is unique in many senses. When you think about compared to, say, legacy tech, right? Google had search that they developed in the early 2000s. And then they started developing a host of other applications, right? Like maps. So Google never looked at maps and said, well, we need money to fund search, so let's license out the rights to develop maps, and so that we can fund Google search and grow it, right? But the natural process of biotech is that you need money to fund your lead programs. So often you're looking for partnerships with pharma companies in order to get that funding. So the last point is what I call the sort of want versus need markets. So want markets are things like social media, right? We don't necessarily need it. It connects us. I think there are a lot of positive benefits, but it's something that people want, right? And need-based is, well, maybe energy, right? But importantly, drugs and new medicines. We need new medicines to keep people living longer. So in need-based markets, it's easier to say, well, we have a population of people, say, that have breast cancer, right? And they may respond to this treatment. And those people, in order to prolong their life and allow them to live healthy, happy lives, may need this drug. So that creates interesting incentives in the biotech market, whereby you're doing this development because people need it, right? So that changes the way that we view the biotech markets and makes it particularly unique. So I've kind of outlined these aspects of the biotech market that were interesting to me, and I think you know, tell us why the biotech market is unique compared to other markets. Um, and in doing this, I sort of zeroed in on the business of biotech as a potential career for myself. Um, Going into consulting offers a lot of advantages because you get exposure to a lot of different aspects of the biotech and other industry markets. Um, and it opens up career opportunities in conventional finance, be it venture capital, private equity. It opens up opportunities to work in strategy in a biotech or pharma company, or in business development. So for people who are interested in these aspects of the biotech market, consulting is a really good jumping off point to getting to the business side of science within biotech and pharma.
Awesome. That sounds like a very great overall of all those different phases, and it sounds like you've had a lot of experience. So specifically with talking about HBP, which is your podcast, right? Which is one of the reasons why you're here today. We want to know, like, how did you get involved in that, considering all the stuff that you've done before? How did you find time? What was the inspiration for it? And ultimately, what are you doing now to this day with it?
So, yeah, the Hopkins Biotech Podcast is a podcast that was initially funded by the Vice Provost's office at the School of Medicine here at the Johns Hopkins University. And I have to give kudos to Ross Chickermain and Jenna Glatzer, who were the initial founders of the Hopkins Biotech Podcast. I got involved a few months after inception. But the Hopkins Biotech Podcast was really started out of a need that we saw for on-demand content to expose grad students to careers outside of academia. And it's a very broad category. When we look back, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, academia was the main path for PhDs, right? You got an academic postdoc and maybe you went into industry after the academic postdoc, but most people got academic postdocs, and that was just the norm. Now, I think it's coincided with the burgeoning biotech ecosystem. PhDs have a lot of different career paths that they could take, but it's difficult when you're wrapped up in actually completing your graduate degree to identify those paths, look inward and say, is this something that I would like to do? And really go towards that path and try to build experiences that would allow you to do what you want to do. So the Hopkins Biotech Podcast initially was careers focused. We would interview individuals who worked in a specific area of biotech, be it legal, patent, and IP is a very common one, the business side of biotech, philanthropy, industry research as a scientist. And we would interview them about their job and how they got there. And it was a simple idea that I think was well executed. And eventually you get to a certain point where you cover most careers that people could have outside of academia. And I can't say that we've covered all of them, but you plateau eventually. Mm-hmm. So we shifted at some point to incorporate not only career-focused discussions, but also technology-focused discussions. And much like your podcast, we're interested in what are the sort of next-gen technologies that are going to fuel future biotech innovation. And in order to do that, we sought people who were working on some of these cool scientific ideas in drug development and interviewed them to discuss not just their career, but also what is their technology and how is this going to impact people in the next 10 to 15 years. And so most of what we do now is introducing those interesting technologies to our audience. And we think that it still serves as a resource because for graduate students who are interested in industry, they need to know what new technologies are on the horizon so that they can jump on that train and get to, some industry that is growing and thriving and going to be a big deal in the future. So that's really what we've done, and I'm really proud of all the work that we've done with the Hopkins Biotech Podcast. Uh, as you mentioned, I'm moving on to a new role, so soon I will not be involved, but the podcast will continue in its current form, and I think it will still serve as a resource to help grad students and even undergrads, postdocs, early career research scientists to become familiar with careers outside academia and new interesting technologies that are going to shape the future.
Awesome. I guess for all the listeners out there who are interested, what's the best way to listen to the Hopkins Biotech Podcast?
Anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can visit hopkinsbiotechpodcast.com. We have socials, most of them if you just search Hopkins Biotech Podcast, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Apple Podcasts. We're on all major podcasting platforms. We have at this point about 80 episodes, I would say. So look through. Hopefully the titles are descriptive enough that you can find something that's interesting for you. But we have a lot of content, and it's diverse, and I encourage listeners to get involved with that.
Awesome. So next question, kind of also for maybe more tailored towards Hopkins students. But we were curious, like, what is Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, or I guess JHTV, and how can people get involved?
Yeah, JHTV is the tech transfer arm of Hopkins. Tech transfer broadly is taking academic research and commercializing it. I talked a lot about this before when I talked about how academics think about drug development. They can only take it so far. You really need commercial partners to get your idea or your invention through to clinical trials and into people. So tech transfer offices at all major universities have a really important role in taking that basic research and commercializing it. Hopkins in particular, for the last 30 or so years, has been number one in receiving grant funding from the NIH. And it's incredible the amount of basic research that we do here, and really high quality research. But frankly, we have lagged in terms of commercializing opportunities, turning basic research into drug molecules compared to other universities that are at the same tier as Hopkins. So JHTV is really going through a cool and interesting transformation right now, where we're not only trying to rev up that drug development engine within Hopkins, but we're also trying to expand the biotech ecosystem within Baltimore. And the advantage that other universities have, just to name a few, Stanford, Harvard, MIT, they get a lot of basic research funding, but they do a lot more commercialization. And I think a lot of that could be attributed to the fact that the San Francisco Bay Area and Boston, Cambridge in particular, are really strong biotech hubs. So if you have a discovery at a university, the tech transfer office recognizes that discovery and says, hey, we want to commercialize this. They have easy access to funding. They have easy access to resources, potentially, co-working lab space. They have huge ecosystems that they can leverage in order to commercialize technologies coming out of universities. So JHTV is going to be at the forefront of trying to do that in the Baltimore ecosystem. We've had a couple of real successes. Thrive Earlier Detection was a company that was founded here at Hopkins and was sold to Exact Sciences for upwards of $2 billion. So we've had some real successes, but it needs to be a constant drug development engine. So what I did at JHTV was I worked in the Commercialization Academy. And this is a really unique opportunity for both undergrads and graduate students to get involved in the tech transfer environment. And what you do is essentially every inventor at Hopkins who has an idea. They report it to JHTV because if it's invented at Hopkins, JHTV has rights to the intellectual property. That's the same at every university. And after that invention's reported to JHTV, the Commercialization Academy Fellows analyze that technology based on the academic and research landscape. So who else is doing this? How mature is the academic environment for this invention? But also market landscape. So is there a market for this invention? Because something's, even if it's a great idea, may not get commercialized if there's not a market for it. So do people want it? So we're able to evaluate these technologies and be involved in this commercialization process at a really early stage. So it's a super unique opportunity. The Commercialization Academy has, I don't know how many fellows now, maybe 20 or 25. I'm no longer involved in the program, but they recruit usually on an annual basis, I believe. So look out for, Commercialization Academy fellow opportunities on your JH listservs. It's a really great program, and I think it's kind of an entry into both the business side of biotech, but also learning about intellectual property landscape and patents. So I definitely encourage your listeners to check that out. And there's a broad range of technologies that you cover, from medical devices to drugs to AI and computing. So anything that Hopkins does here in the STEM field, you'll get exposure to those technologies.
Great. And then I know you talked a little bit about your journey already going through the government and then academia. And so you already touched on this a little bit, but to you, what are the possible careers in biotech that you think right now are surfacing, that you think are really popular, that people should really look into? Maybe they're not as popular. Like, I know you talked about academia and people moving away from academia more toward the biotech industry. What do you see as like the current trend of where people are going potentially, like not only after undergraduate, but even after like postdoc?
Yeah, broad strokes. Academia is one. And as I'd mentioned, academia used to be much more popular. I think there's this coalescence of less people interested in going the academic route because it really requires a lot of tenacity. It's not super well paying to be in a postdoc, and you've spent your last 5 or 6 years living off of a graduate student salary. So it's not the most appealing. But for people who love academic science and want to be a tenure track professor and principal investigator, that is an incredible path, and you can have great success doing that. When looking outside of academia, the most common is industry scientist. So an industry scientist allows you to work at a biotech or pharma company and still be involved in bench research and potentially progress later in your career to managing people, managing scientific research programs. Industry scientist is still a very broad term because there are people who work in the process development and sort of how do we make and purify drugs. That's one aspect that I think is more engineering focused. And then there's the research and development arms of biotech and pharma, which are more drug discovery focused. But industry scientist, I would say, is the most common path nowadays. But there are other paths that people take that are becoming more common. I think, a patent, an IP attorney is one. You could become a patent agent if you pass the patent bar and you essentially work for a law firm that executes patents and helps biotech companies protect their intellectual property. Many people go on to actually receive a JD in addition to their PhD so that they can perform as an attorney. Venture capital is another really popular one. This is encompassed in the business side of biotech. So I would say consulting and venture capital are sort of in the same realm. Venture capital is very promising for people who have entrepreneurial endeavors and really like the startup environment. And the early drug development environment. There's also more conventional finance roles. I've heard of more people now going into biotech equity research. So rather than looking at privately funded biotech companies, actually leveraging your scientific expertise to look at public markets. So banks are hiring more PhDs for their equity research arms in biotech. So there are a lot of different options. One that I forgot to mention, scientific communication, which is also very important, working in conjunction with US government agencies to help communicate science to the public and communicate it to, importantly, legislators so that we can have appropriate regulation and appropriate scientific literacy in Congress. So there are a lot. In terms of, do you need a PhD to do any one of these things? Not necessarily, but I think the PhD does give you a certain ethos to be able to more easily integrate into one of these environments. But I've seen a lot of successful people who have just a bachelor's degree, who are able to progress to become really prominent industry scientists. They're able to work in law firms. They're able to work in venture capital. It's sort of about how you navigate that and being really thoughtful in your career journey.
Awesome. That was super helpful. I mean, I'm someone personally who's thinking about like my career trajectory, and I'm like definitely, I mean, I came into Hopkins kind of doing what you had mentioned, like the traditional, wanting to do a PhD and going the academia route, but I realized there's a lot more options out there, and you just listed a bunch of them. So I think that's very helpful for Hopkins students who are so honed in on either like an MD or a PhD, to know that, there are other options out there. So I think that's very helpful to know.
And I just want to interject. I think for the undergraduate students listening, I think it's really important that after you graduate with your bachelor's, you go out and you get some experience. I've seen a lot of successful PhDs who came straight out of undergrad and started their PhD or MD, but I really appreciated the experience that I got after undergrad before I started my graduate degree, because I think it allowed me to see what opportunities were available. And it really solidified my interest in my future career. So I would encourage you, before you jump right into some sort of advanced degree, like really think about it, take a couple of years, get some real world experience, and I think it's important.
Yeah, I think that's some very solid advice. So I guess kind of pivoting back to the biotech industry in general, I know you kind of touched upon this, thinking about like the pros and cons of biotech, the ethics and profit perspectives. But I guess like in general, I've personally been thinking of biotech as kind of like a net good, because obviously there's a profit incentive, and there's certain decisions that have to be made, right, for the kind of financial well-being of the company. But like in the end, biotech is still what's commercializing these products and getting it to patients and actually saving lives. So I was curious, like, is that the perspective that you share? Is there any like nuances to that you would add?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly important in the age of COVID-19. I think the biotech industry in general became much more center stage in the public sphere, for better or for worse. If we want more medicines, profit will drive continued innovation, and it will fund research and development. I talked about how biotech is very risky and capital intensive. And if we want people to leverage risk capital in biotech, we need some sort of payout to continue that innovation, right? Investors need to recoup their funds. Otherwise, they're just going to put their money in something that's much safer, that doesn't drive innovation and create new medicines. I think an important thing to note in the biotech industry in 2023 is that the past 10 to 15 years have been transformative. Even when I was an undergraduate in the early 2010s, I mean, CRISPR had really just been discovered in its use in human cells and editing genes. CAR T cell therapy was sort of on the horizon. You know, immuno-oncology was this sort of burgeoning field. So these things happen quickly. And what's important to note is that the process of drug development results in drugs that eventually go generic. So companies that develop a drug and once approved are able to sell that drug to make a profit and recoup their research and development funds will eventually face patent expiration, meaning that after a patent expires for a drug, generic drug makers can make that drug and they can make it inexpensively. And what you have is an inexpensive set of drugs that will persist indefinitely, that will continue to help people for millennia, right? One really good example of this is Lipitor, right? So Lipitor is a drug for cardiovascular disease and high cholesterol. And, Lipitor is a generic drug now. All statins are generic drugs. And they're inexpensive and they prolong people's lives and allow them to live longer, healthier lives. The research and development funds for Lipitor were recouped before the drug went generic during the period of patent exclusivity. You could think about examples today like immuno-oncology drugs like immune checkpoint blockade, like PD-1 inhibitors. Eventually, PD-1 inhibitors will go off of patent exclusivity, and some generic drug maker will be able to make it cheaper, and it'll be able to impact more lives, and that will be in perpetuity. So I think the process of innovation and generation of new medicines, while profit is the motive, I think the real motive should be building this base of generic drugs in order to help individuals in perpetuity and decrease costs over time. And there's one individual, he's the founding partner of RA Capital, Peter Kolchinsky. He says this much more eloquently than I possibly could, but he describes this generic drug armamentarium, where it's just imagine a big pile of drugs that continue to go generic over time and are generic in perpetuity and continue to help individuals for little to no cost. So, I think the biotech industry has been villainized in the past few years, but the profit incentives fund new medicines. Without that, we wouldn't have new medicines and we would be at, this steady state that I think would not be good for humanity.
Interesting. And then I guess continuing on with the conversation about biotech, what do you currently see as the future of the biotech industry? I know you talked about that every year, every so often, there are new technologies that are on the horizon that eventually become more popular and eventually get more developed on. So right now, what do you see as the future of the industry? And what are some trends that you think of as interesting that could have the potential to be major players in the biotech industry in the coming years?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic and one that I love talking about. So I have 5 areas that I could talk about, and I'll just introduce them all briefly, right? Things that I think are going to be transformational in the next 10 to 15 years. So we have what people call tech bio, right? So it's the integration of technology in the biotech industry and drug development. We have this area of drugging the undruggable, and I'll go into each one of these categories. We have cell and gene therapy, which many of your listeners, I'm sure, are very familiar with. We have next generation sequencing and data processing and computing, which go alongside with that. And then an area of neuropsychiatry, which I'm particularly interested in. So starting with tech bio, this is in 2023, the biggest, the hottest issue and in the biotech industry in this year, because there's been a lot of buzz around AI in general. Large language models have become incredibly powerful, and they are transforming the way that we live our daily lives. But the integration of AI in drug development is really still being borne out. So I approach this tech bio area with a cautious optimism. I think that large language models will not impact the biotech industry more than they will any other industry. Uh, I think that there's a difficulty in using large language models for biomedical research, and the main problem is this idea of hallucination, where if the whether it's ChatGPT or Bard or Llama, if it doesn't know the answer or can't reference it, it might make something up, and that is really bad in the uh, area of biomedical research in particular. Um, but the power of AI in drug development, we're still trying to figure out what the key questions we're asking are. So two areas of interest that I think are gaining a lot of traction are one, speeding up the time of drug discovery. And the second is increasing the probability of success. So clinical trials and the integration of AI in clinical trials will be helpful, but we can't really do a lot about the regulatory framework of the FDA. Clinical trials take a really long time, and there are certain standards that need to be met when conducting clinical trials. But AI could be important in the area of drug discovery in identifying what are called lead compounds or hits. So these hit and lead compounds are the preclinical drug assets that are screened more in depth in order to identify a specific asset that's going to go into clinical trials. So a lot of AI in drug development has been focused on this early discovery stage. AlphaFold 2 has been incredible in identifying new drug targets and identifying interactions with hit or lead compounds with that drug target. But again, I think the key factor will be whether AI can help us increase the probability of success in clinical trials. And we haven't seen that yet. And there's been some high profile failures in AI aided drugs, drug design this year. So cautious optimism with AI and drug development, but I think it's a really promising area, and I think it's rapidly advancing and something to look out for. The second is drugging the undruggable. So the idea of undruggable targets is one that, if you're not familiar with drug development or basic biomedical science, hard to wrap your head around. Druggable targets are things like enzymes that have active sites in order to carry out its enzymatic role in a cell. Active sites of enzymes are pretty easy to drug because you can design a small molecule that kind of looks like that enzyme substrate, but it inhibits that enzyme's activity. They have these deep active site pockets, and they're kind of sticky for small molecule drugs. Undruggable targets are things like transcription factors, epigenetic targets. Phosphatases is another really important class of undruggable targets that are sort of like shiny round globs that don't really have real active sites that allow you to get a small molecule drug into that target to inhibit it. But there are new classes and new therapeutic modalities that are allowing us to drug these undruggable targets. Two of those are molecular glues and, importantly, PROTACs. So PROTACs are a bifunctional molecule that links a target binding moiety with an E3 ligase binding moiety. So E3 ligases are part of the proteasome protein degradation complex. So what you're doing with these PROTACs and molecular glues is you're bringing together your therapeutic target of interest and the proteasome to degrade that protein. So rather than inhibiting the protein, you just decrease the total amount of that protein in the cell. And we've seen some, really interesting proof of concept data with some of these protax and molecular glues. And I think that's a really promising field moving forward, because rather than having to bind to and inhibit a protein, you can instead just bind that protein. It's really easy to find small molecules that bind to a protein, not really easy, but easier, and link it with this heterobifunctional E3 ligase degron. So really interesting, and I think we'll see a lot of new proof of concept data in a lot of different areas. The third, cell and gene therapy. This is a really hot topic. You hear about it all the time. And cell and gene therapy are biologics, right? They're really big molecules. Cell therapy has shown considerable promise, especially in the area of CAR T cell therapies, so engineered cells to kill cancer, right? We've seen really great results from some cancer types using CAR T cell therapy that leads to essentially a single shot cure. The problem with CAR T cell therapies and cell therapies in general is that they're very expensive to manufacture and therefore very expensive to patients and very expensive to insurers. Now, in the manufacturing process, if we can make it cheaper, then I think they'd be much more widely adopted. And I think we could expand the space of targets for CAR T cell therapies. Another problem, and it's something that's a large field of study, is that these cell therapies, in the case of cancer, have only been used for so-called liquid tumors. So things like lymphomas, leukemias, blood cancers, they can't yet reach solid tumors. And there's really interesting preclinical research and new drugs going into clinical trials to treat solid tumors with CAR T cell therapy. But they're good at circulating within the blood and killing cancer cells in the blood, but not great currently at reaching solid tumors. I think if we get to that point where we can target solid tumors with cell therapy, they'll have a much bigger impact. We've also been expanding the use cases for these CAR T cell therapies. So there's recent results in autoimmune disease that would be very interesting if these have promise in autoimmune diseases. The other problem with cell therapy is that they're autologous in most cases. So the approved cell therapies, you take cells from an individual, you engineer them ex vivo, and then you reinfuse them back into that person. So each person is getting a personalized CAR T cell therapy drug. If we could make it in an allogeneic setting, meaning if we could just take T cells from any individual and engineer them and then reinfuse them back into multiple patients, that would drastically decrease costs of manufacturing. And it would also decrease the time to an individual receiving that drug, because often these individuals who receive CAR T cell therapy are in the late stages of cancer diagnosis. So they don't have a lot of time to wait to manufacture an autologous cell therapy. So that's cell therapy. I'm despite the problems that I've outlined, I'm very keen on cell therapy in the next 10 to 15 years. I just think we have to work towards making it more inexpensive and widen the use cases in order for it to be really impactful. Gene therapy, on the other hand, gene therapy has huge implications, and gene therapy covers, both gene editing and base editing therapies, but also administering genetic material to make proteins that are either misfolded in some disease pathology or not made at all, right? Gene therapy, I think, is really promising because it has huge implications for rare disease. So rare diseases make up many of the total diseases that people are afflicted with. It's just that rare diseases often affect, maybe 100 to 10,000 people worldwide. right? But if we can make inexpensive gene therapies that are specific for these rare diseases, often these rare diseases are monogenic, then we could have a significant impact in decreasing the burden of rare diseases worldwide. So that's my take on gene therapy. It's very interesting in the next 10 to 15 years. Next gen sequencing, super important. This is another technology. I think both of you and probably much of your audience were not even born when the Human Genome Project was completed. That was this huge effort to sequence the entire human genome. It cost, millions to billions of dollars. And now we can sequence the entire human genome using next-gen sequencing for maybe $1,000, right? And it's getting cheaper and cheaper. There's a technology called Oxford Nanopore that allows you to perform sequencing of kilobases in a device that's about the size of a USB. So next-gen sequencing has huge implications and is auxiliary to the whole drug development landscape, because next-gen sequencing allows us to identify genetically validated targets to go after genetically validated targets that are involved in disease pathology. And so it really supports the whole drug development ecosystem. This goes along with, data processing and computing and our ability to process these really large data sets and, use artificial intelligence to screen these data sets. So next-gen sequencing supports all of the work that we do. And it's only increasing in its capacity to expand and grow and become more inexpensive. And then the last piece is on neuropsychiatry, and in particular, in my opinion, I feel very strongly about this. One of the largest public health issues that we deal with today is mental health disorder and substance use, right? And drugs to treat, say, major depressive disorder, anxiety. Many of these drugs are old drugs, right? There are generics, and many of the newer drugs to treat major depressive disorder have been developed in the last 20 years. And, in many cases, they don't really work. And the burden of mental health disorders in not only this country, but across the world is massive. Substance use has become a really big issue in the past 10 to 15 years. So we need better drugs to treat neuropsychiatric disorders. One really interesting application has been in the use of psychedelic medicines, in particular esketamine, which is under the brand name Spravato from Johnson & Johnson. That drug is a derivative of ketamine, and it's used to treat major depressive disorder. In the works now, phase 3 clinical trials are being done with both MDMA and psilocybin for use in major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. These drugs show real promise in helping individuals that are dealing with mental health disorders. And I think overall we need a better class of drug to deal with these really large and public health burdensome disease areas. The last point I'll make on that is also in pain. So non-opioid pain relievers and non-addictive pain relievers will be another really strong area of research in the next 10 to 15 years. So I said a lot of things, and I think I outlined, those 5 areas to some extent, but, there are no shortage of interesting areas of science that will be unveiled in the next 10 to 15 years that are going to have huge impacts on society.
Yeah, I think that was a really great overview. Could you just repeat the 5 things again, just for our audience to hear them again?
Yeah.
As a recap.
Yeah. So tech bio, AI and drug development, drugging the undruggable with molecular glues and proteins, cell and gene therapy, next-gen sequencing and data processing and computing, and neuropsychiatry focusing on substance use disorders and other mental health disorders.
Awesome. Yeah, that was super helpful. I think the last one, neuropsychiatry, is particularly dear to me because as a neuroscience major, is something I've talked a lot about in my neuroscience classes and, diseases and disorders classes and drug discovery classes. So I'm glad to hear that's like one of your 5, promising trends in biotech. So obviously, you become extremely knowledgeable about, biotech, through all your experiences. For our listeners out there who maybe want to learn more about biotech and keep up with the trends in the biotech industry, what would you recommend as like the best ways for people to, get educated, keep up with trends, and, really just learn as much as possible and again, keep up with what's going on in the biotech world?
Yeah, there's always a lot going on, so it's difficult to always try to stay up to date. There are some free resources like Biospace and Fierce Biotech. Those are 2 newsletters that are free and have really good information about the current state of biotech. Uh, I mentioned Peter Kolchinsky, the founding partner of RA Capital. He has a course that I think he runs maybe like once a year. That's free. It's called The Business of Biotech. I took it, I think, in its inaugural year, but that was really helpful in helping me wrap my mind around how biotech companies are funded and how investors look at a biotech company from the standpoint of their science and probability of success in clinical trials. There are some paid services, but Hopkins students, I think, can get free institutional access to Endpoints News and Stat News. Those are 2 really great news organizations focused on biotech and healthcare that I found super useful. There are some books by a group called Pharmagellan. It's like Pharma and Magellan. The author is Frank S. David. He's a former physician scientist, and he writes really eloquently on analyzing clinical trials, biotech forecasting. They do really good work, and it's really kind of deep dive on some of the topics that we discussed today. And frankly, Twitter or X.com, whatever it's called now, I use that a lot for up-to-date real-time news. One person that I really like in particular is Brad Loncar, Loncar, Brad Loncar. He recently started this venture called Biotech TV, where he does a lot of interviews with people in the industry, and just follow people that he interacts with, and you'll have a really good slate of constant information about biotech deals, clinical trial results, interesting trends in the industry. Another account to follow is Bruce Booth from Atlas Ventures. He's a venture capital private equity guy. He does this year-end review of the biotech markets that I think is super helpful. I listen to that yearly. And there's a group that does a biotech hangout Fridays at noon. And it's just really, a great group of industry people that talk about the news of the week. And I found that very useful too. So there's no shortage of free resources if you just look hard enough and follow the right people. So that's what I would recommend.
And the course you had mentioned by, what was his name? Peter
Kolchinsky.
Kolchinsky. Yeah. Is that through Hopkins?
It's called Business of Biotech. No, it's he just runs it through if you go on the RA Capital website and look for Business of Biotech, you should be able to find it. And I can maybe provide you a link that you could put in the show notes.
Definitely. I guess I would also add, like, just from my experience at Hopkins, if you're looking for any good courses, if you're a neuro major, Diseases and Disorders of the Nervous System is a great class because you actually get lectures from all parts of industry and people who are at Hopkins who are doing really incredible research, who are leaders in their fields. So that was a great class. I took a class on drug discovery, which was really interesting. It's called Drug Discovery for Neurological Disorders, and that was with someone who was in the biotech industry for several years. So he was able to give you the whole context of what it takes to really bring a drug from like conception all the way to commercialization. And then to the list of people that you had mentioned, I would also add, I like Adam Fine, who's like the Drug Channels Institute, I think is what it's called. He has some really interesting like YouTube videos and like a website where if you're interested in like the whole interactions of like the healthcare system in general, not just biotech, but like insurance companies and like pharmacies and, you know, that whole like channel or drug channels from, you know, how are people paying for the drugs? Like, how does the flow of money and the flow of like the supply of drugs work? I think that's a really interesting resource. So just like adding that to your list of like really great resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. For the basic biomedical education, you know, I've just been in school for 20 years, so I don't know if I can help you there. But yeah, no, I mean, like, just be a consistent lifelong learner and, you know, staying up to date with the basic biomedical discovery, I think, is also important. You read the literature, read broadly. You know, if you're working in neuroscience or infectious disease, read new research in cancer. You know, read new research in autoimmune, rare disease. I think it's really important to have a broad outlook on basic biomedical research, and that will allow you to, I think, perform even better in your sort of therapeutic area niche.
Yeah. And then our final closing question for this podcast episode is, what advice do you have for students either trying to get an internship or searching for jobs? What was the process like for you? What do you recommend for other students? So any tips that you have, especially with all your experience that you've already had and shown us already.
Yeah, right now it's tough. It's a tough job market. There's no sugarcoating that. You know, networking is really important. I would say that's the ultimate thing that you could do. Networking with alumni, going through the process of career exploration, figuring out what you want to do, and really writing that down, trying to verbalize, because you probably will get asked in an interview, you know, why do you want to work in biotech, right? So you need to have a good understanding of what interests you, and yeah, and then go out and talk to those people that are doing it. That's the best thing that you could do for yourself. The good thing is that, especially for undergrads, you're very marketable, because, you know, entry level research associates are pretty cheap for a biotech company, and they don't really expect you to know everything coming in, but be able to show interest and be able to show tenacity and the ability to not only think critically but also rethink decisions, because the hypothesis driven process of science is that, well, sometimes things don't work out exactly like you thought they would, so you have to think again and figure out what to do next. So yeah, just be open and enthusiastic. Nobody expects you coming out of undergrad to have a ton of experience, but they do expect you to show up to a job and really want to be there. So be able to show that.
Awesome. I think that's great advice. Well, thank you, Joe, for coming on the podcast. Really, really great information. I think our listeners will find it very helpful. I found it extremely helpful, just to think about, you know, the trends in biotech and, you know, how to learn more about it, and all the advice you gave was great too. So we'll definitely include, you know, all the resources that you mentioned in the show notes. I'd also, maybe I'll ask like a question to the listeners of like, you know, what do you see as like, you know, your favorite trends in the biotech industry, or what are you excited about? But yeah, appreciate you coming on, Joe. Good luck with, you know, your next steps. And, you know, again, appreciate you coming on, and go check out, the Hopkins Biotech Podcast. We'll also link that. So we'll catch you soon, Joe.
Yeah, Nicholas and Ricardo, thanks for having me on. And any of your listeners, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. And if you want to reach out to me, I still have an active Hopkins email address. So yeah, happy to chat with anyone. I love talking about this stuff. So
awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Yep. Bye.
See ya.